My name is Ashley Early, and I am here with Alex Pennington, and you are listening to the Aspiring Writers United podcast, where we talk about writing advice, editing tips, and coaching for publishing success.
Hello, everyone. I am today with Rosaria Munda. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So to start us out, can you just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm the author of Fireborn. It's a young adult fantasy novel with Penguin Random House, and it's the first in a trilogy. The second one, Flamefall, came out in March, and the third one will be coming out soon. I'm writing it now, or editing it now. I live in Chicago. My husband, my cat, my turtle, and I'm originally from North Carolina. I grew up there. I lost my accent when they sent me away to school in the north. And yeah, that's about all there is to say about me, I guess.
So side question. I actually almost saw you in person at one of your book events.
Oh really?
I couldn't make it. It was one in Seattle or by Seattle.
Oh, yeah. Man, that was back in the day.
Yeah.
So you've been following these books for a long time since they were published. That was the first.
Yeah, no, I have. They're really good.
Oh, thank you.
So what would be like
the
elevator pitch for your book?
There's a couple of different ones, but usually what I use in an event is like Fireborn is about these things. It's been a while since I've done an in-person event. So Fireborn is about two orphans in the aftermath of a bloody revolution who ride dragons. And then I go into a bit more detail and I talk about how one of them was a dragon lord's son and he had everything before the revolution, and then he lost it all when there was a change in power. And the other one, Annie, was born a serf, and so she was very poor and had very little before the revolution. That changed for her in the opposite direction during the revolution. And after that, they met in an orphanage. They both tested in to a new dragon riding training program, and now they're at the forefront of their nation, leading the nation, and they have to decide what side they're on as their nation faces an oncoming war. So it's a story about childhood friends who grew up to realize they have very different pasts, possibly very different loyalties in the present, and how they're going to work that out with each other.
That sounds like a more mature version of How to Train Your Dragon, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, and actually I do often talk about that too. I really was inspired by How to Train Your Dragon. Originally, I didn't really consider myself a dragon person, I guess. I know now, having written dragon books, that there are a lot of people out there who really, really love dragons, and I never really thought of myself as that kind of reader until I watched How to Train Your Dragon. For me, that really changed it, because I was like, oh, these are very interesting. Like when you think about what you can do with a dragon sort of technologically, how it affects the world's politics, that bond between the dragon and the rider, like what does that mean for a society? That was really where I found my point of interest.
I've often heard your books compared to the kind of political side of like Game of Thrones.
Mm-hmm.
Where did all this come from? This like political side to the story?
I think, honestly, I think it was, there were a couple of things that sort of came together for me at the same time. So I was in college when I was reading Game of Thrones. I think How to Train Your Dragon came out around the same time. So there were sort of dragons in the air. And I was in a class about ancient Greek political theory. So we were studying Plato and Plato's Republic. And all of that kind of came together into one idea that I'd previously been playing with as actually a story about fighter pilots. And I think just sort of being sort of surrounded by these dragon stories and thinking about dragons in Game of Thrones, the way they're sort of weapons of mass destruction, I was really interested by that. And with Plato's Republic, one of the sort of conceptions in the book is they're trying to figure out how would we make a just society. And one of the ideas is, what if you take children when they're very young and you take the best and the brightest, you train them to become rulers. And when I read that, I was like, why would you ever do something like that? That seems like a terrible idea. And then I was thinking about the sort of trope of a dragon choosing a rider, which is sort of, I think you see that in a lot of dragon riding stories. And I was like, well, if you had a society where dragons were very much a part of the culture and you had this sort of way that it worked where they choose riders very young, you could almost be compelled, if you were trying to create a juster version of that society, to do some sort of selection process like Plato's Republic to find your dragon riders. And then you could sort of create a world a little bit like Plato's Republic, just with dragons. So that was kind of how it all came together.
Did you have like this kind of spark where you had to sit down and write that story immediately, or did it come a little later?
It was delayed because I was in college and I had other things I was doing. I had a senior thesis at the time that was a creative thesis in addition to my political theory thesis. But sort of the way creative writing departments tend to work and the way mine worked is you want to write something, I guess literary would be no fantasy, no dragons. So I wrote a more like typical literary novel that was very bad. And that was what I did during those years in college. But the year after when I was free, I started drafting Fireborn almost immediately. I was actually living in China at the time, living in Beijing. I was working there teaching English for a year after college. And so in between teaching English, I would go to like the cafe down the street and I would work on Fireborn. And so then I think a lot of the post-revolutionary sort of ethos that put into the story was very much inspired by talking to people in Beijing whose parents had lived through the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution under Mao. It was really interesting hearing the stories, and a lot of that like inspired some elements of Fireborn.
Something I personally loved, and I know a lot of other people did, is it's a propaganda side to it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh yeah. And that was a big thing that I was inspired by living in Beijing, mostly because I felt like I was interested in the sort of differing attitudes about propaganda that you encounter. So I think Americans, the word propaganda is like a bad word, like we think of it as a bad thing, even though I think it's not like we don't have propaganda. And if you look at sort of, American campaigns, civic campaigns, especially in the 50s during the World Wars, they very much feel like propaganda in sort of the typical sense. So I was interested by the way when I talked to Chinese people in Beijing, they didn't have quite the same attitude about it sometimes. Like someone told me he worked for CCTV, like Chinese television, and there was a guy on the news floor who was like the uncle who would just let you know if what you were publishing was maybe not aligned with the party. And that was kind of the way the propaganda worked. It was very sort of a soft level of propaganda that everyone was more or less like kind of comfortable with. Like you would occasionally encounter someone who like was like, I've read the truth. Like I get my news from Taiwan. But for the most part, even sort of the westernized Chinese people were just kind of like, this is just how we get our news. And I really wanted to sort of depict that kind of propaganda and that kind of like attitude about your authoritarian state in Annie and Lee. So like, this is just what they've grown up with. There's just a ministry of propaganda and that's how it works. And then maybe in later books sort of start to pull at those threads a little, but I really did want to start with that just being the status quo and not really commenting on it.
I feel like that goes really hand in hand with the your inspiration from Plato. Because, in every kind of like dictatorship thing, you have that we're going to make the perfect society. And then the propaganda that says that they're succeeding, that there's nothing wrong here.
Yeah, absolutely. And Plato actually talks about propaganda in The Republic. So another very controversial element, like probably the most controversial element in The Republic that artists especially like to complain about, is that he says at one point, he concludes that the Iliad and the Odyssey would need to be banned from this just world because they inspired the wrong emotions in people. They somehow make people less virtuous. And for the ancient Greeks, this would be unimaginable. It would be like banning the Bible for Christians. Like you don't ban Homer. But he was sort of making this very daring claim. I found, in essays in college when I would try to sort of argue with this, it's actually very hard to make the case that art shouldn't in some way be held to a virtuous standard from the perspective of a society. Like, why would you not censor it? And it's very hard to make that case. I think we all have this instinctive sense that it's wrong, that somehow art is good for its own sake, but it's difficult to prove it. And so I wanted to sort of wrap that into the story too. So there is the part in the first book where they ban their epic, their sort of equivalent to Homer. The new regime bans it for reasons that they think it's maybe inspiring the wrong sort of values in citizens. I really wanted that to be an echo of the Plato's Republic.
Did that kind of go into like how history is only written by the victors? Like you have the Odyssey and the Iliad that are looking pretty good for the Greeks, but then there's this other perspective of the people, and it's like, well, was this actually that good of a thing for everybody?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think with those texts, I think they were written so long before. So like the timelines for Plato, it would have been like 500 years before that, the Odyssey and the Iliad would have come into being. So I don't think there was a sense of who won and who lost in the story that you would necessarily personally identify with. You might identify with the Greeks versus like the Trojans, who are sort of broadly speaking like Asian as far as anyone can really tell. So I don't, in another sense, I think people tend to actually sympathize much more with the Trojan side of the story, even though Achilles Achilles and that crew are kind of ostensibly the main characters, there's a lot more pathos and tragedy that's really attributed to the losing side. So yeah, I don't know. The question of history being written by the victors is interesting. And it's interesting specifically in Homer, the way it's kind of turned on its head in a way, just because the Iliad is a story about war that makes you deeply, deeply, deeply relate to the losing side, to the opposite side. And the sort of most poignant moments in the story are when there's sort of these moments of like peace between the two sides where they come together and recognize common ground before they go back to waging war with each other. So I don't know. Those are just my rambling thoughts on that.
I love it. What was you talked about writing your book after college. So what was how did you become a published author? What was your journey?
Let's see. So I wrote it in China and then I came back and started trying to get it published. And it took me 2 years to find an agent. I had like 70 plus rejection letters, and it was I learned a lot in those 2 years. I think the longer you try to get published, the like more you realize, like, I don't know, the more humble you become. Because I think when I went into it, I was like, oh, I'm like such a good writer. I'm gonna get an agent so easily. And it was not the case. It was really hard. And I got a lot of rejections. And at that time I was quite, I was just out of college basically. And I had sort of kicked the can down the road of picking a career aside from writing. And especially in China, I was like, I'll teach English. And then I got back and I was sort of working odd jobs while my husband was in grad school. And I think honestly, those 2 years were really good for me because in the meantime, I realized like, okay, I need to figure out what matters to me in this world aside from writing and really kind of look into like, what do I want as a career that's not writing? And I think when I was able to kind of let go of writing as this end all be all, and I ended up training to become a Montessori preschool teacher and I loved that work. And I had a beautiful classroom that I was working with my students in. And then I had a breakthrough where I got an agent and then things started moving really quickly. We sold the book in like a month.
Wow.
And yeah, it was wonderful. And we sold it to a really fantastic editor at Putnam. And then it's like, again, the further you go down, the more humble you become. Because at that point I was like, oh, and I've edited this book so much in these past 2 years. And then with my agent, it's like so ready to publish. And my editor was like, it's not ready to publish. And so then we revised it again for another year, which is like a long time actually by the standards of publishing. But like the more time your editor gives you, the better the book has a chance to become. So I was really grateful for it. And by the time we'd sort of finished, I was able to run like plagiarism checks on like if you use one of those softwares that compares two documents and tells you how much is the same. I did that for the first draft and the final draft, and maybe only like 10% were the same. And I know I feel very strongly that what ended up being the book is like the book I was trying to write all along that I was not quite figuring out how to write. So all of those revisions were just very important to the process.
You just had to like grow into it in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a lot of editing though. That's kind of amazing to think how much work goes into a single book like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think now that I have sort of seen that process, I can sometimes when I read books, I'll be like, this is a really good second draft, but I think it needed a little more time. Like you can sort of see it now, it's an interesting, sort of background sense of how a book works. I think there's a sense when you talk to people about editors, people who are not in publishing, they'll often say things like, stay true to your vision, don't let her change your vision. But I think that's a very big misunderstanding of like what an editor is doing because, they're really helping you find your vision and actually be able to communicate it to other people. And I think it's very hard to do that without the eye of an editor who really pushes you.
Ashley is actually an editor by profession.
Oh, really? Well,
yeah.
I just have nothing but praise for you. What kind of editing do you do?
Mostly book editing. So like
nice.
Developmental and proofreading mostly with a lot of clients. How many rounds of edits did you go through with your editor actually?
Like depending on how you count it, like 6 for the first one.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. And I think usually you're lucky if you get like 3 in I think traditional publishing.
Yeah, the turnaround time of a year is what made me ask that. I was like, there's no way that had to go through more than 3 revisions.
Yeah. Although some editors, there are horror stories about editors who take 6 months to get back to you. So that would easily be a year.
What you did with point of view, what was your decision on that? Because I've actually considered going kind of between the first and third person, but what were your thoughts on that?
Oh, you mean the way the flashbacks are in third and I'm not sure. It was really like that from the beginning. Oh, I'm glad glad you like that. It was structured like that from the beginning, and I'm not really sure. I can't remember that being a decision. I know that the decision to make it in first person for the main narrative, I think I had just read The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater, and I was like very, very impressed by kind of the way she uses that dramatic irony where you're in the head of two people who kind of misunderstand each other as like a romantic setup. I thought that was just like brilliant, and I really wanted to do that. And I knew the book, I felt like I wanted to deal with these sort of political, philosophical themes, so I wanted to counterbalance that by having kind of very intimate, like inside their head narratives to kind of make sure you were on the ground with the characters. And then the third person part, it was just always in my head. It was always going to be like that. I think the sort of reason for it, if I had to like explain it now, would be that so much of what I wanted to be exploring with Annie and Lee was kind of the things they're not letting themselves think about each other and kind of about their pasts. And I think you can't really appreciate that until you know what they're not thinking about. And so I kind of wanted there to be this layering of like, you know, like you can sense there's something they're not thinking about, and then it kind of grows, and then you realize like, oh, that's what they're not thinking about, and then there's kind of this moment of revelation, and then from there they start to think about it a little bit more, and you can just kind of like lattice it like that. And so that was why I wanted that third person distance. And I think when there's also an element of like the third person is about all things that happened when they were younger, and I think first person, I think narration from a younger character doesn't work as well because they're not so aware of what's going on around them when you're 6 or 7. And I wanted that kind of like third person, more omniscient voice to be able to describe what's going on. That way you don't have to rely on a 6-year-old to tell you what's going on. That makes sense.
That does. They probably won't actually know their surroundings and what's happening around them, like you said.
Right, exactly.
Did you relate to one of the two characters more? Like, how did you go about creating them?
I think, you know, I always say I related more to Annie because I think I did draw on a lot of boarding school and college experiences of kind of being like in a different place than where I was from, you know, like the sort of fish out of water scholarship kid experience to writing her side of the story. But I will say that she was the second, her voice actually came much later. In the beginning, it was really Lee's story. She was kind of a side character. She had a voice, but she had a point of view, but she didn't have as much of her own arc. I think Lee was I started the idea of Lee and his like sort of internal conflict was what I think I was always drawn to, but I don't think of it necessarily as being anything like anything I've experienced in my life.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
What's your process? Are you a pantser? Do you outline? How do you go about creating a book?
You stole my question.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no. Well, actually, I'm curious to ask the editor which kind of writer you find more like, do you find a difference between the pantsers and the plotters that you work with? Like, do you notice? Can you tell which kind you're working with?
It depends. I don't ask any of my clients how they go about things, but sometimes I can tell when there's like a lack of, okay, this scene is, you know, it's good. And then all of a sudden they jump off to another thing in the next chapter. I'm like, wait a second, where's the structure? You're kind of missing the connection here. Something's got to go.
I feel like if you'd outlined, this wouldn't be my problem.
I don't think there's like the process works for everybody, but sometimes you can tell with clients where I'm like, okay, well, you kind of need to plan out how these two things are going to connect.
Going to go.
Can't find a connection. Something's just got to be removed or it's got to be changed.
Yeah. I think I don't know a good way to get around the fact that I feel like I write whatever I do, I write the first draft wrong. Like it's always just really bad. And my sense is even if you're the world's best plotter, this still can happen to you. So I don't know. And I do plot beforehand, like I do write out an outline usually, but the sort of initial concept is usually a bunch of sort of scenes that I have in my head that I need to somehow like string together. And then I string them together and that's the first draft. And then the characters sort of lack agency because they've just sort of been dragged through this like series of events that I needed to get them through. And then the second draft, like I sort of have to go back and like make it be them doing the moving, they like having their own agency. And then, I think I have a much easier time figuring out what's not working after I write it. So it's very hard for me to write a good outline that does what I need it to do, even though I will write one, I'll follow it, but it will end up always having problems. I don't know. I don't know if that's a good answer.
No, Alex is the outliner here, and then like the complete plotter, and I'm the plantser because I can't stick to one of each.
No, yeah. I think somewhere in the middle is most people. Yeah.
I actually just got done revising the first like 5 chapters of my book and just completely rewriting the outline.
Yeah, it sometimes helps me to, I think revision plans where you write out an outline can be really helpful, I think.
How many drafts did you do before you sent it to an agent?
That's a good question. I did a fair number and then I kept revising while I was querying, which was those 2 years. So basically I probably like 3 big revisions before I started querying, and then many, many more within that time. So even if like I've done the document comparisons even with the first draft and like the one we sold, and that one was still like probably only maybe 50% or like less, maybe 25% was the same. Like it was mostly changed. So I think, it's like for me, what I would do, and I guess this is still effectively my process. It's a little different now that I have like an editorial team, but I would write the document, then I'd reread it and figure out what was wrong, change it, get it as good as I could get it. Then I would give it to like a new pair of eyes, like my husband or a friend, and then they would read it and they'd tell me what they didn't like.
So how easy was it for you to accept the necessary changes that your editors gave you?
That's a really good question. I think I got better at it. So much of it is about trust. So I think you have to kind of build, especially for sort of more bold edits, you have to kind of sometimes like make a leap of faith to trust someone to tear everything apart and see what happens when you build it up again. And so I think initially with my editor, she's a very like she really likes to tear things down and see what happens when you build it up again. And so I think that was like scary at first, and I really did balk at some of the things she wanted to do. But I don't know, somewhere along the way, I started really like getting it. Like I was like, oh, this is brilliant. So I always joke that she was like the crazy genius in our relationship, because she'd be like, well, what if you just threw all this out the window? And it was always like, no, that's the best part. But sometimes you just the sort of process of breaking it apart and putting it back together, you would get something even better.
Yeah.
So, and I think, yeah, go on.
Oh, sorry. I feel like I have a harder time like getting like indie authors on board with those changes, with like big changes. So I was just curious about that with traditional publishing. So I feel like some writers are just so close to their work, they're not willing to make the necessary changes that will really improve their work and put it into an box that makes it where they can actually publish something really special.
Yeah. My editor at one point was like, your readers are teenagers and they're going to crave more descriptions of dragons. And I was like, whatever, I don't believe you. And it turns out she was right. And I think that like she knew what a teenager would want because she works in a commercial setting. And I think just being aware, and especially after the first book came out, started watching, I don't tend to read reviews, but occasionally like my husband will show me, funny ones that he sees on Goodreads. And I think I find it very interesting just to kind of wrap your brain around the idea that there's so many different people out there in the world who are going to respond to this book so differently than you imagined they would. And you're what you're trying to do when you're writing a book that's going to be published is to sort of maximize the number of people that get something that they want to get out of this book. So it's really a different mindset than writing for yourself or than writing for for an award or anything like that. You're thinking very differently. And I think a big part of like just accepting criticism from your editor gets you there faster. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you.
I remember when I think it was your first book first came out, that there was like an onslaught of dragon photos in your story.
Oh, yeah. Maybe.
They're pretty good ones too.
Oh.
Well, by fans making them.
Maybe. It's been a while. I think I did, I was more careful in the second book to go back because I don't tend to describe things very much. So I'm kind of like, well, everyone knows what a dragon looks like. But it turns out, no, like my editor was so right. People crave descriptions of dragons. And so for the second book, I really did take care to make sure I was describing the dragons more. And I saw enough reviews to know that people had noticed it, because people were like, oh, in this book, you really feel like you can see the dragons. And I was like, yeah, that's, I think it's those little things. People talk about being true to your vision, but it's not like I had a vision to not describe dragons. I think there's an awareness you have of audience that, for these small elements that can make a big difference. I think you want to make sure that everyone's sort of like enjoying the story in the way they're going to enjoy the story.
Speaking of having a vision for something, so do you have all the books in your series planned already?
Well, it's a trilogy and I finished the second draft of the third one. So I think
okay, yes, you do.
Now I can say yes.
I couldn't recall if it was a trilogy or how long.
No, it's a trilogy. Yeah.
Do you have anything planned after this trilogy, if you can talk about that?
I have some ideas percolating. I don't think they would be in this world. I feel like I've done this world justice. I have an idea for something I could do that would maybe be a spinoff, but I'm not sure I would ever want to, not anytime soon, would want to
come back to it later.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just thinking of like Aragon and some of these other like dragon books. I feel like yours really stands out against them though. Did you read any of the other ones for inspiration or just to see what they were doing?
I read Aragon back in the day, like when it came out. One book that I know my books are compared to is Dragon Riders of Pern, which I've not read. At this point, at this point it's intentional. Like I'll read it after I'm done, just because I feel like one of those, there's sort of an element of like you can be inspired by things, but also like you don't want to feel like you're stealing or, I think if there's something, if it's so similar, I'd rather just sort of innocently write my own story and then later I could go read it and be like, oh, interesting. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I also read Seraphina. I love Seraphina, but that's a very different type of dragon book.
Heard of that?
Yeah, it's very good. It's shape-shifting dragons, so it's kind of slightly different. I mean, I think the big difference, I didn't want the dragons to be talking. I didn't really want them to be actors in their own right. And, it turns out actually people have a strong sense, readers will have a strong sense of what type of dragon they like best. And they don't necessarily articulate this, but when they go to a dragon book and they don't find that kind of dragon, they can be a little frustrated. So I've heard people respond to Fireborn with frustration because they wanted more of that kind of talking, sort of wise dragon feeling, which is it's just an interesting thing to observe. So I always want to put like a disclaimer on the book, like these dragons do not talk.
That there are people that want a specific type of dragon to be represented in the book. That's I've never thought of that. I love it.
I wouldn't have expected it either. I think, people know what they like, and I respect that.
Like, this dragon doesn't talk. I'm not for this book. I'm sorry.
I was just reading some reviews. This is kind of my thoughts. Like, whenever I hear people describing your book, they rarely say the dragons first. Like, I feel like a lot of, actually kind of the older readers, they really get hooked into the political side of things. It's like you have the political book, and then there's dragons that just make it so much better.
Right. Like the dragons are, I think the type of reader that really likes this book are the ones who like politics, and then the dragons can be a bonus. But the people who are going into it for the dragons are always like, wait a minute. Yeah. And I think dragon books don't tend to be super political. I think really George R.R. Martin kind of pioneered that concept, like a political dragon book.
Yeah.
So I think there is sometimes there's like a type of reader who's going in, like just because of the dragons, and they're not necessarily the sort of reader who likes politics. And then you get,
I think that's kind of like where you brought the genre a little forward. 'Cause that's something I think people tend to say they don't like as much. And whenever you get a dragon book and it's only about the dragon just breathing fire and fighting other dragons. But where then you have all this extra stuff, and it's like it makes it kind of a more realistic and complete story.
Oh, I'm glad that you liked it. That's how I felt about it too. That's why I really liked it.
Definitely stands out. We appreciate that.
Oh, thank you.
You've been around quite a few like YA novel authors and have kind of seen the more modern look of the genre, haven't you?
Yeah.
Where do you think it's kind of going? Or like, do you see any trends? Because it seems like there's a lot of kind of new, deeper, like with your concept of having the propaganda and all the things. It seems like the fantasy genre, especially YA, is getting more deeper in a way.
Maybe, yeah. I think, what I'd really like to see is to have sort of an explosion of sci-fi fantasy, like sci-fi young adult books, because I feel like we've, within the industry, it's young adult fantasy is considered kind of like at this point, like, I don't know if bubble is the right word, but people feel like it's saturated. I think Fireborn kind of came in like at saturation point. So that was like 2019. So I feel like there were these, unlike with dystopian, there wasn't like a single blowout successful YA fantasy that I think we can all really point to conclusively the way you could with like Divergent and Hunger Games. But I think there are just a ton of YA fantasy titles out there. So I feel like we're really overdue for some sort of like big genre shift into something new. And I would love to see more sci-fi, but it seems like it hasn't. There's Aurora Rising a little bit with Jay Kristoff, but I think we're still waiting for that big sci-fi book.
Actually, they actually talked about a couple of times now the kind of saturation that's happened in the YA genre over the years.
Yeah. And in general, YA is very saturated, and a lot of YA authors are moving into middle grade, which makes me think middle grade will soon be very saturated too. So I'm just sort of spectating at this point.
That's interesting because most of my clients are moving to more adult since YA is so saturated right now.
Oh, that is interesting. And these are clients who are trying to get an agent, or what stage are they at?
It depends. Some of them are just going straight into just self-publishing themselves, and then others are looking at me to help them try to get an agent and just get an opinion on, X, Y, and Z. But like I feel like this is something that a lot of people ask, like, how do you stay true to your characters as you're writing?
I mean, That's a good question. I don't think about it. I don't think about it like that. So I'm trying to figure out what the answer would be. I mean, I guess I have a sense of who these characters are. It's kind of determined by their backgrounds. I think over 3 books, you can kind of lose sight of where they came from. So sometimes it helps. It does help, I think, actually, to be in touch with readers who've read because I haven't read the first or second book in years at this point. And so for me, it really helps to talk to readers. Like if I'll get a beta reader who has recently read, like a beta reader for the 3rd book who's recently read the first 2 books, who can be like, well, I didn't feel like this was really like what I was expecting to happen based on what happened in book 2, on this page. And I'm like, oh, I forgot it. Some of those little things where you're like, yeah, those details, I really do rely on other eyes. But I think also there's a sense in which I like to set up a character with a sort of sense of their wounds and their past and the thing that would sort of ideally like lead them to a better place or like heal them in some way. And I think the vision is to get them to that point by the end of the trilogy.
So speaking of that, how much do you focus on like a character's morality and the way they view the world changing from book 1 to book 3?
I mean, I guess that's always a part of it. I mean, I like to sort of tie their sense of morality, as you put it, to like their experience. So how are they, what things are happening to them to change how they feel like they should act in the world, or like what kind of world it is that they live in. And I liked the idea of starting out with them fairly complacent with their world in the first book, and then the second book kind of like jostling that and kind of making them sort of decide what was important to them. And then in the 3rd book, similarly, like a different kind of jostling, but deciding, I think in the 3rd book, I think of the question being more like, should we even engage in politics at all? Or should we just kind of like give up? Or should we back out? And I wanted that to kind of be the sort of final question is like, do you like, should, like, this is all so hard. What's going to make us like go back in and keep trying?
I think that's especially important to your story. I mean, just for the fact that one government fell and this other one rose, that's supposed to be kind of the savior of it, and it's like, but it's not working.
Right.
How do we? What's even the point? It's like we did this whole revolution and everything. Like, what do we do now?
Right. And in a sort of microcosmic way, Annie and Lee sort of experience that for themselves in the second book, because they go to all these lengths to like improve on the revolution, and then it kind of in certain ways backfires for them, and so then they sort of have to deal with that aftermath in the 3rd book is the idea. No spoilers.
So how much history played into that? So that seems like something that just really is really realistic.
I mean, I guess trying to think of how I would describe it's different things inspired different elements. There's not any real direct analogs, I would say exactly. I think in general, I wanted there to be a cycle where you start with the sort of Plato's guardians in the Plato's Republic system, and then it slowly gets dismantled. And like, how does it get dismantled? And I wanted there to be a progression from an authoritarian regime to a democracy, but then also exploring the problems of democracy. Because I think often the scope of especially YA novel is that like, oh, we go from authoritarian to democracy, and then it's all better. And I kind of wanted that second punch of like, no, there's still some big problems. I think, I wrote the second book and was sort of thinking it up sort of during the Trump years. And I think for me, sort of watching the democratic process going in ways that people had not expected or had not wanted was very interesting. And I kind of wanted to explore that on the page. So I guess that's not even really historical. It was almost more current events.
Crazy years.
Yeah, it was crazy years. Yeah.
In my head, I was comparing it to like the Hunger Games and their totalitarian government, but we never really got to see their government that much. Like,
yeah, she's very light on the details. I do love the way she kind of ends with that twist where Katniss realizes the problem is sort of this never-ending problem, right? She doesn't eliminate the leader that you think she's going to eliminate. I thought that was, I think Suzanne Collins is actually quite brilliant. I recently read the prequel novel, which I just adored. I thought it was like more my cup of tea than the original trilogy, although I understand why it's not most people's cup of tea, but she opens with like epigraphs, I forget which one, from like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And like I was a political theory major in college, and like these are kind of the sort of like contract theorists. It was basically like a 500-page essay about contract theory, and I was like, oh my god, it's amazing. So I really loved it.
You kind of touched on something, the never-ending cycle, or that how it seemed like in a lot of YA books, it's like you defeat this one person, and then the world is all fixed and good. But what I liked about the Hunger Games is that not really. It's like we still have issues moving forward. Right.
Yeah. And I think the problem there is, I think, and this is kind of where I get frustrated by like grimdark sort of fiction, is like you can sort of fall into a state of like nihilism or fatalism when you sort of stop with that point of like, oh, actually it's all bad, it will always be bad, like that's a very, I think, facile like conclusion to just kind of be like, there's no point. And so that was, I kind of wanted the third book to pull it all together and sort of be like, okay, here's the point. Like here, we do have to still fight for something, because there are some things that are just so much worse. Even if there's no clear cut answers, in some ways it's pretty simple. Like there is in the end of the day, there is something right and wrong, and you have to fight for something.
Dismal nihilism. That's actually, because I write YA personally, and that's kind of the issue that my main character is facing, or that's going to be facing in it. It's like, okay, I did all this work, but I didn't really change anything, and already think they're kind of going backwards.
Right.
And
I think that's, that can be hard to do. I think being aware of like what a teenager comes to a book to learn versus an adult is something that I've sort of had to slowly appreciate. Like I think nihilism is interesting to adults. I think it's upsetting to kids, and not necessarily always it's not necessarily upsetting in like a good way. And so I think thinking about like what are the different ages, what kind of things are different ages getting from this book, or from, I think one thing I've noticed that younger readers will really like when they're into the philosophical elements of my book, what they seem to like is the idea of a moral dilemma. Sometimes it's the first time they've encountered a moral dilemma, and I think they find it very interesting. It's like you can always tell when you're talking to a young person who's like thinking about the concept of a moral dilemma for the first time. But I think it is a really interesting like theme that, when you change things and they still get worse, like how do you explore that in a young adult book in a way that's not, that's more than just depressing? Like what can you sort of bring to it? It's an interesting question.
We need to not ruin the escapism for everybody here.
Yeah.
Like towing the line between like actually showing reality and then trying to wrap up like a happily ever after ending for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting the level that you push it, because I think kids can handle a lot. I think and I think people often underestimate how much they can handle, but I think what they're getting out of it is a different question, and and you are getting something different out of it based on what age you are.
What is kind of the main lesson or takeaway you're putting, or that you're wanting your readers to have after reading your story?
I think it's important to remember that like every question that we sort of face as a society is like usually unsolved because it's very complicated, and because there are a lot of people with very different perspectives who disagree about it for reasons that they all find valid. And I think that doesn't mean we should disregard people as human beings. Like I think there's a level of respect for like disagreement that I hope comes through in my books, but at the same time I hope that doesn't come with a sense that like moral relativism, it's all a wash. Like I think you can sort of both respect someone who disagrees with you and think that they're wrong at the same time. And so I hope that I would hope that would be something that people would walk away thinking about.
I feel like that's a really relevant message to the world today.
I think about it a lot these days. It's true.
I'm afraid we are getting close on time. Ashley, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, it's more of a question for her to answer, for Rosa to answer. Do you have any final words of advice for our listeners?
Oh, well, what sort of listeners are they? Are they aspiring writers or readers, or like what kind of?
More geared toward writers.
Towards writers. I think, I don't know. Yeah, I guess in keeping with what we were talking about earlier, like don't be afraid to listen to criticism when it comes your way. It's the most valuable thing you can receive. I mean, you have to respect the person who gives you this opinion, but if you want your book to be read by others, it's very important to listen to what your readers are telling you. Because even if they don't know the solution, if they're not getting out of the book what you want them to get out of it, that's data for you, and that's very useful. And then just to keep writing, keep revising it, keep writing.
That's the important part. Keep writing, keep revising.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm still just in like fanboy state right now. You're on here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, all right. Well, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and maybe we can have you on here sometime again when your new book gets closer to coming out.
That sounds like fun. I would be happy to come back.
Thank you.
Awesome.
All right. Well, take care, both of you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.